And good morning again, everyone. Good to see your happy, shining faces this morning on a beautiful day. Well, I'm going to start this with a little bit of interaction. I'm going to ask you a question. What day is this? Who can tell me what day this is? Sunday. What else? Divine Mercy Sunday. Okay, what else? Tax Day. Half of you are accountants out there. It took you a while to remember that. There's still something else that today is special for. Anybody know? Yes, the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, when Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslow went down with the ship. So if I ask you then what day it is, you notice that there are a number of responses that you could give. And if I said to you on that same kind of note, and if I gave you the name of the disciples, one by one, what would be the first word that would come out? What would be the first thing that you would think of? Like, for instance, if I would say Judas, what would be the first word that you would associate with him? Betrayer, okay? What if I said Peter? The rock. Hey, good. Excellent. If I said Simon. No, not Simon Peter, the other Simon. No, not the leper. Okay, see, now we're starting to get... If I said James and John, what would you say? Sons of thunder. Good, good. Now, here's the big one. If I say Thomas, doubter. Boy, I heard that real loud. Isn't it strange, though? In fact, I feel like poor Thomas got the bad rap. One action defines his whole life. Thomas the doubter. You know, it's interesting. In the first three Gospels, we don't know anything about Thomas other than his name. What we know about Thomas comes from the fourth Gospel, John. And even in that Gospel, it's not a lot. But what do we know about Thomas from John's Gospel? Not just that he doubted. If we go to the 11th chapter and you remember the scene where Mary, the sister of Lazarus, asked Jesus to come and see her brother because he was ill. And Jesus waited for 2 days before he went. And he said to his disciples that he was doing it for their behalf. And finally, he said to them, "Let us go to Bethany." And his disciples couldn't believe what he said because they had just been there and people had thrown stones at him. There was a price on his head. People were hostile to him. They wanted to kill him. The disciples said, "Lord, you want to go back to that?" And Thomas responded to the other disciples, "Let us go with Jesus and die with him." Now, why don't we remember that scene from Thomas? Why don't we call him from that Thomas the courageous? We don't define him from that one action. Now, if we go fast forward again to chapter 14, Jesus begins that chapter by talking about his Father's house. "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places, and I'm going to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, you may be. Where I am going, you know the way." The disciples didn't have any clue what Jesus was talking about. They didn't understand him. But they didn't have the guts to ask what he meant, except Thomas. Thomas responded not just for himself, but for all of the disciples. Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Now, why don't we call from that scene honest Thomas? It took courage to ask the question. It took honesty to ask that question because they were all in bewilderment of what Jesus was saying. Now let's fast forward now to today's gospel. And we hear that very familiar scene. Thomas saying, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, the opening in his side, unless I can put my fingers into those holes, unless I can put my hand in his side, I will not believe. We're all familiar with that. But let's not forget what happens after that. Jesus appears. Jesus shows his hands and his side. What we forget is that all the disciples were incredulous. All the disciples couldn't believe what they saw. In Luke's gospel, he says that they all thought that they were seeing a ghost. They couldn't believe it. Even allowing all of them to see and to touch his hands and side. He had them all do it. They were still in unbelief. And what did he say? What did he do? Do you have anything here to eat? And so he ate a piece of baked fish in front of them so that they would believe, finally. It wasn't just Thomas who doubted. They all doubted. But then finally, once Jesus showed his hands and his side to Thomas, what did he do? Let's not forget this. It was him and only him who fell down to his knees and said, "My Lord and my God." In all of the Gospels, there is no event, no scene among any of the disciples that said anything so definitively, so emphatically. It is the only place in the gospel that we equate Jesus with God. And it comes from Thomas. He makes the greatest of all declarations of faith. So why don't we remember that scene? Thomas, the faithful. You know, my friends, one of the many messages that this teaches us, that doubt is not the opposite of faith. Unbelief is the opposite of faith. Thomas believed, so much so that he went down to his knees and said, "My Lord and my God." Not even Peter said that. You all, I'm sure, know and heard of Albert Einstein, right? The great physicist, the man who discovered the theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. I don't know what that means, but in his later years, he taught at Princeton, and he was the prototypical absent-minded professor. I remember reading once about him that he was so deep in thought that he left his house and was walking on the campus of Princeton University having not even realized that he had forgotten to put on his pants. Can you imagine? Well, one time he was traveling from Princeton someplace on a train, and the conductor was coming by to click, to punch the tickets. And he came up to Einstein, and Albert Einstein was looking in his vest pocket, couldn't find it. He put his hands in his pants pocket, he couldn't find his ticket. He opened his briefcase, it wasn't in there. The conductor said, "That's all right, sir. I know who you are, Dr. Einstein. I'm sure you bought a ticket. Don't worry about it." So the conductor walked off and was punching some of the others' tickets. And just a few moments later, the conductor looked back at Einstein, and he saw him. He was on his hands and knees, looking under the seat. And so he went back over to him and he said, "Sir, that's okay. I know who you are. You don't have to worry about it." And Einstein got up and he said, "Young man, I too know who I am. What I don't know is where I'm going." My friends, we may not know where we're going in this life, but it's enough to know that we know the way. And we can thank Thomas for that. "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" Jesus says, "I am the way." That's all that you need to know. We know in tradition, my friends, that Thomas went to India to evangelize, to be a missionary. And we know that because of his deep and profound faith, he died a martyr's death. And that's why we have another title for Thomas. It's why we call him Saint Thomas. We are all called to be saints. God bless you.